Welcome back to another season of In the House. I'm your host, State Representative Michael Day, coming to you from the newly refurbished studios here at WinCam, and thrilled to have you back with me. This, as you know, or likely know, is a monthly talk show where I bring in guests to talk about issues of the day, and mostly focused on issues going up at the State House here in Boston. With me today, I'm thrilled to welcome Ron Fein and Jasmine Gomez from Free Speech for People. We're going to be discussing today kind of the proliferation of rights, if you will, to corporations here in the United States and what kind of responses we can have from a legislative perspective. So very happy to welcome Ron and Jasmine here. And let me just give the viewers a quick background of who you all are. Ron Fein is the legal director for Free Speech for People. Previously served as Assistant Regional Counsel in the United States Environmental Protection Agency's New England office, where Mr. Fein received the EPA's National Gold Medal for Exceptional Service, the National Notable Achievement Award, and several other awards. Mr. Fein previously clerked for the Honorable Kermit Lopez of the United States Appeals Court for the First Circuit, and the Honorable Douglas Woodlock of the United States District Court for here, the District of Massachusetts. He's also worked as an independent consultant to nonprofits, as Deputy Campaign Manager for a congressional campaign in the software development field, for which he was awarded 9 patents. Mr. Fein graduated Order of the Coif from Stanford Law School and summa cum laude from Harvard College, so already far more intelligent than I am. Welcome, Ron. And Jasmine Gomez, really happy to welcome you here, Jasmine. Jasmine is the 2016 to 2018 Democracy Honors Fellow at Free Speech for People. Ms. Gomez is a graduate from the BU Law School, Boston University Law School, where she served in the Journal of Science and Technology Law and has written about potential state responses to corporate big data surveillance. During law school, she served as the co-president of the Latin American Law Student Association, vice president of the American Constitution Society, co-chair for the First Year Advisory Program, and networking chair for Outlaw. She also received the Emerging Leader Award from the Black Law Students Association, and while in law school, Jasmine interned at the Charles Hamilton Houston Institute for Race and Justice, where she examined prosecutorial misconduct and Title VI enforcement, and worked with other organizations to create the first Massachusetts statewide conference on criminal justice reform, known as Massachusetts in the Carceral State. Welcome, Jasmine.
Thank you.
I always try to get on people far more intelligent than I am, so happy to do that again here today. So you're both here from Free Speech for the People. And Ron, why don't you tell the viewers what Free Speech for People is?
Sure. So Free Speech for People is a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization, and we were founded in January 2010 on the very day that the Supreme Court decided the Citizens United decision. And the Citizens United case, for those who don't know, is a case in which the Supreme Court held that corporations have an unlimited right to spend an unlimited amount of money in elections under the First Amendment to the Constitution's protection of freedom of speech. And what we work on at Free Speech for People is restoring and revitalizing our democracy to bring forth the broken promise of political equality for all, to get big money out of politics, to push back against the concept of corporations exercising constitutional rights that is so often used to strike down local, state, and federal laws.
Great. And so how big is the organization?
We're not a large organization, but we punch far above our weight. I think we're up to about 9 people right now, and we have a legal office here in the Boston area, but we're actually a national organization.
And you've got initiatives nationwide, right?
That's right. We're working on legislation in not only in Massachusetts, but also in Florida, in Connecticut, and all over the country.
Great. Jasmine, how did you become involved with Free Speech for People? You came in right out of law school as a fellow.
Yep. So while I was in law school, actually, I worked a lot through my externship on the criminal legal system. And so I worked a lot on both the legal aspects of it, but the advocacy too, policy advocacy. And during that time, we worked a lot with grassroots organizations that dealt with communities that were most impacted by the criminal law system. And that was primarily communities of color. We would contact them and ask them what sorts of things, what policies do you want to be passed in order to kind of get rid of the system of mass incarceration. And oftentimes the policies that were promoted by communities of color were incredibly different than the policies that were being promoted on the state level. And so communities of color often talked about reinvestment in the community, the demilitarization of the police, less money for prisons and more mental health facilities. And oftentimes the policies that were advocated for were things that would give more money to police officers or prison systems. So body cams or more programs in the prison systems. Not to say that one is right or wrong, but it was very stark to me to realize that there was like an entire community whose voices weren't being heard. And so it was during this time there was a lot of conversation going on in the political arena, primarily through Bernie Sanders and other politicians talking about Citizens United and the unequal influence of money in politics. And he talked a lot about how the middle class was not having their policies promoted because the policies that were being promoted were to make the rich richer. And so I thought about how that affects more than just the middle class, but also the marginalized communities that I was dealing with as well. So, I saw the Free Speech for People job posting, and I thought if I really want to do advocacy, I need to address some of the biggest roadblocks to our democracy. And I really thought that money in politics is one of the biggest roadblocks. And so, I thought it was most important for me to kind of talk about and think about the questions of how do we get big money out of politics. And yeah, here I am today.
That's great. So you'd mentioned, Ron, Citizens United as the kind of seminal point of founding of this group, of Free Speech for People. And I know there's been a lot of different type of agitation, response, thought going into what a response should be or look like to Citizens United. Could you just talk kind of generally to the viewers about what Citizens United really did, how it changed from the status quo, what was before Citizens United, and really what that case is doing now?
Yeah, so Citizens United struck down a law that was almost a century old that prohibited corporations from spending money in elections. It also prohibited labor unions from doing the same. Now, that didn't mean that people who worked at corporations couldn't put their own money into donating to candidates or spending otherwise, but it meant that the corporation couldn't use the corporate treasury to spend money to influence elections. And Citizens United struck down that law at the federal level, and follow-up cases struck it down, similar laws at the state level, and said that corporations have a First Amendment right, that freedom of speech under the First Amendment extends to corporations putting literally unlimited amounts of money into the political system, whether they're spending it directly or whether they're giving it to an organization like a super PAC, which is something that was created by a post-Citizens United decision. And so it really has two sets of effects. One is the flood of money into politics, which we've seen, and which I think laid the groundwork for some of what happened in the 2016 election. And the other, though, which is less discussed, is the continued extension of constitutional rights to corporations, which are artificial legal entities that derive their very existence from state governments. And while they're important parts of our communities and deserve to be treated as such, they're not people. They don't have the constitutional rights as people. And Citizens United continued the trend of giving corporations the constitutional rights of people.
So, Jasmine, I want to talk in a second about what you're working on,
Yeah.
particularly with Citizens United in response. But what do you say to the argument that Section 1 of the U.S. Code defines a person as a corporation?
Well, I think that there's a lot of places in the law where we democratically have chosen to define the word person to include a corporation. It can also include things like a municipality. And I'll give an example. So in the Clean Water Act, for example, it defines the word person to include a corporation. And that's for a very practical purpose, which is that many of the provisions of the Clean Water Act are designed to apply to something that happens whether it's an actual person or a municipality or a corporation or anything else. So for example, the prohibition on discharging pollutants into a river, the Clean Water Act doesn't care if it's an individual doing it or a corporation, so it just says no person may. Conversely, corporations also can sometimes have rights if the statute, the law that the people pass, wants to give them those rights. So for example, under the Clean Water Act, if you're not happy with a regulation that EPA issues, it says a person can challenge that, and that person can include a corporation. But that's because Congress wrote the law specifically to do that. And if we decide that we don't like it anymore, we want to not give a corporation a certain right under the Clean Water Act or any other law, federal or state, we, elected representatives, can change that law. The problem comes when the Supreme Court comes in and starts saying that the US Constitution, which is not easy to change, requires that corporations be given the same rights as people. The only way to undo that is by undoing the Supreme Court decision, either by another Supreme Court decision or by a constitutional amendment.
Okay, which leads us to your efforts, Jasmine.
Yep.
Why don't you talk just a little bit about what you've been working on since you started at Free Speech for People?
Yeah, absolutely. So a lot of what I've been working on is passing a constitutional amendment to overturn Citizens United on a federal level. But in order to do that, a lot of the times we're taking a very grassroots approach. So we're doing it locally and by the states. And so we work with just local grassroots organizations, other money in politics organizations, to actually go and get people fired up, get them to pass ballot initiatives that will support an overturning of Citizens United to compel the legislators to go ahead and pass it on the federal level so we can get it ratified. So a lot of the work I do kind of focuses on that constitutional amendment for exactly the reasons that Ron said. And that's that the only way that you could really overturn the decisions of Citizens United, other cases that extend corporate rights to corporations, so like Hobby Lobby, and just money in politics generally, so like Buckley versus Vallejo. These are Supreme Court cases, and these are cases that, you know, are made by the legal theory that the Supreme Court has decided should be applied. So again, the only way to overturn that is either through a constitutional amendment or if the Supreme Court was to overturn itself. The reason that we focus on the constitutional amendment is because citizens know best what they want in a constitutional amendment in order to actually protect themselves and their own communities. If we rely specifically on the Supreme Court, we don't 100% know what elements they're going to overturn. We don't know if they'll decide that corporations get these rights but not these rights, or if, you know, people can spend unlimited amounts of money in politics but not corporations. And so just kind of taking away all that uncertainty is by us going through this democratic process and this grassroots initiative to make sure that the people get the final say. And amendments are permanent, unlike Supreme Court decisions.
And because they're permanent, they're difficult to pass, right?
Exactly.
So it's not an easy task you've got ahead of you here.
No, it's not an easy task. And that's actually one of the benefits of it, though, is that you need broad cross-partisan support, not just even bipartisan, but everybody needs to be in support of this. And thankfully for money in politics, that is an avenue where most people support. 84% of people think that money has too much of an influence in politics. So this is something that the people truly do want. And it's just that we need to get the representatives to see how much the people want it.
So where are you now in the process? I mean, success, roadblocks, what are we looking at right
Yeah,
now?
we have 18 states so far who have passed resolutions in order to get an amendment to overturn Citizens United, and over 700 different communities who have passed that. In Massachusetts, I believe there's 207 communities who have passed it, and the legislators already passed a resolution. We're working with grassroots organizations, though, to see in Massachusetts if we'd be able to also get a ballot initiative through so that the people can vote and we can see the percentage of people in the state of Massachusetts that really do want this amendment to be enacted.
So can you talk just mechanically, how would a constitutional amendment, I mean, we've never seen one in our life, if I recall correctly, right? Have we?
It depends on
On
how
what
you
we're
feel about the
talking about,
27th Amendment, which was
Right.
ratified in 1992.
Right. So for those born, the millennials, how about that? Get away from it that way. How would the process work to actually pass a constitutional amendment?
Yeah, so there's a couple of different ways that you could pass a constitutional amendment, and I can talk a little bit about the ratification process, and you might want to talk about Article 5. So the ratification process, it requires 3/5 of the state legislators to vote for, well, so first the amendment goes through Congress, and Congress votes.
Federal Congress.
Yep, the federal level. And Congress goes ahead and votes for passing the amendment. And then after the amendment is passed, 3/5 of the state have to then ratify that amendment in order for it to be a constitution, into the Constitution.
And Jasmine had referenced Article 5. Now, as a legislator, I've heard a lot of pros and cons on a bunch of different sides on whether or not we should amend both the state constitution. We're looking at a fair share amendment coming up in this constitutional convention in Massachusetts. But on the federal level, obviously, Citizens United is taking up a lot of oxygen on that end. The Article 5 route that Jasmine referenced, could you explain that to the viewers who may not have heard of that before?
Yeah, and It's important to understand that the founders of the Constitution made two ways to pass a constitutional amendment, but we've only ever used one of the
Right.
two. They're actually both found in Article 5 of the Constitution. And both end the same way, but they begin differently. The way that they both have to end is that an amendment has to be ratified by 3/4 of the states, as Jasmine said. The difference is how the amendments even get submitted to the states. So under the route that we have used every single time before, what happens is Congress, both houses of Congress, pass an amendment by a 2/3 vote, and then it gets submitted to the states for ratification. We've used that over our history 27 times successfully to amend the Constitution. The other route that has been in the Constitution since the beginning, but which has never gone all the way through, is that the states can call for a convention and work around Congress. And when 2/3 of the states call for a convention, then this convention can then propose amendments which would have to get ratified. We've never done that. There have been calls in the past for a convention, but none of them have ever reached the required threshold. And there's a lot of uncertainty as to what would happen if a convention were actually called. So
We hear, or I hear a lot, concerns about a runaway convention, right? They're called, in this case, specifically for this type of an amendment, right? To essentially overturn Citizens United, to demarcate exactly what a corporation is, what it's not, what it's entitled to. But there's an open question, I think, as to what happens once an Article 5 convention is called, right?
I think, what's important is just to reiterate that we've never done it before. Unless you want to count the very first constitutional convention, we don't have specific experience. There have been state constitutional conventions at the state level, although less and less frequently, and it's not clear exactly whether they provide a good model for what a federal constitutional convention would look like. At this point, we're promoting as our primary solution that it should go through Congress. But to get the best value out of that grassroots approach, we are using the strategy that Jasmine described of not starting with Congress and then saying, oh, now let's go talk to people at the state level, but rather get states to pass resolutions at the state level. And we've already done 18, and these have passed everywhere we've put it to a vote, calling on Congress to pass this amendment and saying, when you pass it, we will ratify it.
Let me shift gears a little bit, because we had talked a little earlier about the courts now granting rights that we traditionally think of as individual rights to corporations. And Citizens United obviously deals with the First Amendment, right? The right of speech. That's what the Supreme Court has couched that decision in. Jasmine had referenced earlier Hobby Lobby. And one of you could discuss what Hobby Lobby is, and then we can get into kind of a legislative response to that.
Yeah, I'll take Hobby Lobby.
Go for it.
So Hobby Lobby was one of a pair of cases that went up to the Supreme Court in 2014, and it raised the question of whether corporations have religions. And this is a notion that to many people may seem counterintuitive. Corporation is an artificial legal entity created by the state government, but in both of these cases, the corporations were making the claim that the investors and directors of the corporation, who did have strong religious beliefs, should be allowed to use their religious beliefs as a basis to claim exemptions under federal law, an insurance requirement. And in one case, the case went up on a statute. That was Hobby Lobby. There was a companion case that went up under the First Amendment, freedom of speech, but they both raised the same basic claim, which is, can the investors or the directors of a corporation extend their religious beliefs to the point where the corporation is claiming a religious exemption from a local, state, or federal law?
And so this, to me, was and I think to a lot of folks who watch the Supreme Court, even more jarring than Citizens United. Citizens United, there was a visceral reaction, which I think was appropriate. But this to me, starts getting into some really dangerous territories, especially when we're talking about our traditions of equality, both in America and particularly here in Massachusetts. And with those traditions of equality, traditions of civil rights protections that we've constantly made progress on. But as we heard from Jasmine earlier, we've got a long way to go on equal protection. And so you and I had talked, Ron, about a legislative response, and I had been kind of kicking around some general ideas, and you and I worked together I think very well to hopefully craft a nice piece of legislation. Could you talk a little bit about what we've introduced or what I've introduced in the legislature with your help?
Yeah, and I'll be happy to talk about that, and Jasmine can maybe color out some of the ways in which it could actually apply in practical life. So the danger of the Hobby Lobby ruling is that it could be used in a lot of circumstances, and where you do have religion influencing business, sometimes it's a positive, where you have people, because of their religious beliefs, going above and beyond what the law requires, but in some cases you have business owners or companies claiming religious beliefs as a basis to seek an exemption from anti-discrimination law. And we've seen that happening already since Hobby Lobby. It usually tends to focus on issues of gender identity and sexual orientation, although you could imagine it in a wider variety of scenarios. So the bill that we have worked on would take a stand and say, let's look at what a corporation actually is, because corporations derive their very existence from state law. And so this bill would amend the Massachusetts General Laws, Chapter 156D, which is the chapter that enables a business corporation to even exist and operate in the state, to say that the powers of a corporation, which are defined in that statute, do not include claiming religious exemptions on behalf of a corporation for exemptions for claims of discrimination under federal or state law. And in order to really make that have some teeth, the bill also says that if there's a situation where conduct violates both federal and state anti-discrimination law, and a corporation makes a claim that may exist right now, unfortunately, in federal courts, to say that this discrimination law can't be enforced against this corporation because of the corporation's supposed religious beliefs, well, the state law isn't going to take it. And in fact, if the investors, directors of the corporation want to break down that wall between the corporation and the board of directors, between the corporation and the investors, then the wall is broken, or as they say in corporate law, the veil is pierced. And what that would mean is that if a corporation makes that type of claim, then under state anti-discrimination law, then the officers and directors of the corporation would be liable themselves, not only the corporation itself. So what that could mean as a very practical matter is that if somebody had a discrimination lawsuit against a company, and the company claimed that it had a religious right to ignore the discrimination laws, maybe that's going to work in federal court, but when it comes to state court, if they lose on their case, if the person proves that they were discriminated against, then you could go after the president or the officers of the company and not just the corporate treasury to satisfy that judgment.
Yeah, the limited liability protections go away.
That's right.
Right? We grant, as a state, we grant limited liability protections for corporations for a variety of reasons, to foster innovation and encourage investment in private endeavors. But the thought behind this law is that we grant you these rights, we can take away these rights if you're acting poorly or not behaving, to put it in a kind of a parental terminology here. Jasmine, just as we wrap up here, could you tell folks how we can find out more about Free Speech, Free People?
Yeah, go to freespeechforpeople.org. That's the best way to. We've got all of the information on our website. We've got a lot of different projects that we're working on, not just dealing with the campaign, but it goes well beyond, not just dealing with the amendment campaign, but well beyond that as well.
And what opportunities, just in the last couple of seconds, what opportunities are there to actually get involved?
Yeah, so there's an organization called American Promise, and they're going to be working on the ballot measures and the ballot initiative to go ahead and overturn Citizens United on the Massachusetts state level. So if anybody is interested in working on trying to overturn Citizens United here in Massachusetts, definitely go to American Promise. I think next month they're going to be having a Citizens Uprising event. So they'll be getting a lot of grassroots activists at that time together.
Not pitchforks, I think.
No. Petitions.
And then for our other work, freespeechforpeople.org, we have opportunities for people to volunteer.
Yep.
And certainly if there's any students who are looking for internships, we have opportunities like that as well.
Great. Well, thank you both to Jasmine and Ron for coming out today. And I know when you talk about corporate law, there tends to be a glaze that comes over people's eyes as we get into that. But I think, obviously, based on the discussion here today, this is a really active area of where we are in today's law and where we're going in the future. And I encourage the work that you're doing to continue fighting that fight, and look forward to working with you in the future.
And thank you for your leadership on this issue.
Well, thank you both.
Thank you.
Thanks. Our country has achieved great prosperity, and our economic strength on a global scale is unparalleled in history, in large part because we provide certain protections and specific rights to corporations. From the automobile to the light bulb, from life-saving medical advancements to having the ability to rewind live television, the private sector drives innovations in the United States that have revolutionized our way of life. We provide limited liability protections to directors of corporations and tax advantages to investors that encourage private industry. We've done so since our nation's founding. This choice, first made by our nation's forefathers and continually reaffirmed by leaders throughout the ages, has proven to be, for the most part, a very profitable and sound decision. Our laws, our legislators, and our courts have provided and upheld protections for private industry continuously throughout the ages. The very first section of the United States Code, 1 U.S.C. Section 1, reads, "In determining the meaning of any act of Congress, unless the context indicates otherwise, the words person and whoever include corporations, companies, associations, firms, partnerships, societies, and joint stock companies, as well as individuals." This clause provides essential protections to a corporation that would otherwise have a difficult time doing things like enforcing terms of contracts with individuals or defending itself against claims brought against it in court. In the 2001 case, a unanimous Supreme Court held in Cedric Kushner Promotions versus King that incorporation's basic purpose is to create a distinct legal entity with legal rights, obligations, powers, and privileges different from those of the natural individuals who created it, who own it, or whom it employs. In recent years, though, we've seen our courts extend the principle of affording certain rights and protections to corporations to what many believe are an absurd end, by affording to private corporations rights guaranteed to individuals under the United States Constitution. For example, in 2010, the Supreme Court ruled that an advocacy group called Citizens United had a constitutional right to spend money on political advertising based on the First Amendment. In 2014, the Supreme Court expanded this concept to freedom of religion in the Hobby Lobby case, when it held that corporations with religious owners could not be required to pay for insurance coverage of contraception for their employees. Many individuals who follow the Supreme Court jurisprudence, including me, recognize that seemingly limited holdings are more often than not used as a foot in the door to further expansions of these rulings. So while it can be argued that Hobby Lobby only allows a corporation to refuse a federal rule regarding the specific type of insurance that a company must purchase for its employees, those who fear that this holding can be used to justify allowing a corporation controlled by individuals of a particular moral persuasion to refuse to provide services to certain individuals or groups based on moral objections are equally justified in their concerns. It is this fear that a private corporation would attempt to claim a moral objection to justify refusing service to an atheist or to a homosexual or even to someone who is of a different gender, and use the Hobby Lobby case or some other federal rule in the future as a protection for that behavior, that led me to file House Bill number 767, an act to strengthen civil rights. Our government grants corporations their rights. Our government, therefore, can also restrict or suspend those rights. If passed, this law would simply state that the powers granted to a corporation by the state do not include an assertion based on the purported religious belief or moral conviction on the part of the corporation or its officers or directors of an exemption from federal or state law prohibiting discrimination. It also states that in any court proceeding concerning the conduct, activities, or transactions that are alleged to violate state or federal law prohibiting discrimination, the president and treasurer of such corporation and any officers or agents having the management of that corporation lose their individual protections from liability and shall be liable for all damages caused by that discriminatory conduct. Discrimination has no place in our commerce, and a corporation cannot have a moral objection to anything. We are a stronger country because we are a more diverse country, and if we have any doubts about that, we should look to the words of Charles Evans Hughes, who is regularly hailed as one of the leaders of American conservative political thought. Justice Hughes was the 11th Chief Justice of the United States from 1930 to 1941, and before that had only narrowly lost the Republican nomination for president to Woodrow Wilson in 1916. Delivering remarks on the 150th anniversary of the Battle of Bunker Hill at Faneuil Hall in 1925, Mr. Hughes proclaimed, "When we lose the right to be different, we lose the privilege to be free." I'd like to thank WinCam for once again offering this show, and for the work of Melody Wing, Suzette Ferdinand, Dave Gauthier, and Anthony Gameri. Thank you for watching.